You're listening to Classical Music Discoveries. I'm David Devine, and today we turn our attention to a subject that is both vital and often overlooked: the extraordinary impact of American composers on the world of classical music. From the sweeping symphonic landscapes of Aaron Copland, to the rhythmic brilliance of Leonard Bernstein, to the bold innovations of Florence Price, John Adams, and so many others, American composers have reshaped the classical tradition with a voice that is unmistakably their own. Their music captures the vastness of the American experience, its optimism, its conflicts, its diversity, and its restless spirit of invention. In this episode, we explore how these composers expanded the boundaries of orchestral sound, forged new musical languages, and helped define what classical music had become in the modern era. Their contributions are not just important. They are essential to understanding the evolution of music in the 20th and 21st centuries. So settle in and join us as we celebrate the composers who gave America its symphonic voice.
While Vivaldi, Bach, and Handel were filling European concert halls with some of the most sophisticated music ever written, America was, and this is not an exaggeration, a musical backwater. The Kennedy Center puts it bluntly: if you looked for classical music in the early days of America, you'd be hard-pressed to find it, even in the big cities. And yet, somehow, this same country went on to produce composers who didn't just join the classical tradition, they rewired it. Today, we're getting into the importance of American composers to classical music, where it all started, who the key figures were, and how the so-called American sound ended up reshaping music far beyond U.S. borders. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how a nation that started with psalm books ended up giving the world Rhapsody in Blue, Appalachian Spring, and minimalism. My guest today knows this territory inside and out, so let's just get right into it. Take me back to the very beginning. How did classical music even get a foothold in America?
So the starting point is genuinely humble. According to Wikipedia's entry on classical music of the United States, the earliest American classical music was basically part songs used in religious services during colonial times. We're talking psalm books brought over from Europe by settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Psalm books. That's the origin story.
Right, and here's a detail that kind of blows your mind a little. According to Wikipedia, the first music publication in English-speaking North America was actually the Bay Psalm Book of 1640. And not just the first music publication, the first publication of any kind. Music came before everything else.
Wait, so before newspapers, before anything, there was a music book?
Before anything. Which tells you something about how central music was to those early communities, even if it wasn't the grand orchestral tradition we associate with classical music today.
So how did it grow from there? Because there's a pretty big gap between a colonial psalm book and, say, Carnegie Hall.
A huge gap, and it was filled by institutions. According to Active Minds, the Protestant singing schools in New England were among the first American institutions to actually foster musical arts. Those schools grew into larger choral societies. The Boston Handel and Haydn Society was established in 1815 and focused on performing sacred works like Handel's Messiah.
So it was very much a community-driven thing at first.
Exactly, and then the infrastructure started catching up. Active Minds notes that Lowell Mason, who lived from 1792 to 1872, is largely credited as the father of American public music education. He helped establish the Boston Academy of Music in 1832 and introduced music education into Boston public schools by 1837. After the Civil War, conservatories started appearing. The New England Conservatory opened in 1867.
And what about the audiences? Were Americans actually hungry for this kind of music?
They were, and a lot of that appetite was fed by European touring musicians. Active Minds lists some remarkable names. Swedish soprano Jenny Lind toured in 1850, organized by the showman P.T. Barnum, and it was wildly popular. The New York Philharmonic was established in 1842. The London Symphony Orchestra's website notes that Tchaikovsky himself conducted his works at the opening of Carnegie Hall.
Tchaikovsky at Carnegie Hall. That's a flex.
It really is. And the LSO piece points out that German symphonic music had a particularly strong place in the American repertoire at that time. So for a while, America was essentially a very enthusiastic consumer of European classical music rather than a producer of it.
So when did that start to shift? When did American composers start saying, okay, we're not just going to imitate Europe anymore?
There's a really interesting turning point in the late 19th century. According to Grokipedia's chronological list, a group called the Second New England School emerged, also known as the Boston Six, and they were trying to build a professional American symphonic tradition. Names like John Knowles Paine, George Chadwick, Edward McDowell, most of them are largely forgotten today.
Most of them. There's an exception?
Amy Beach. The London Symphony Orchestra's article highlights her as the first American woman to write a symphony, and she's attracted renewed interest in recent years. According to the Arfa Foundation, her Gaelic symphony was a turning point. She used ancestral folk melodies to inform a grand symphonic structure and proved that American talent could compete on the global stage without just mimicking European models.
That's a significant milestone. And there's also the Dvorak angle, right? The Czech composer who came to America?
Yes, and this is a fascinating chapter. Grokipedia notes that Antonin Dvorak had a residency in the US from 1892 to 1895, during which he composed the New World Symphony. And crucially, he urged American musicians to draw from Black spirituals and Native American music to forge a unique identity. That sparked real debates among Native composers about what American music should actually sound like.
So a Czech composer was essentially telling Americans how to be American in their music. That's a little ironic.
It is, and it's also kind of profound, because he was pointing at something real, that the most distinctly American musical material wasn't in European concert halls, it was in the folk traditions, the spirituals, the everyday sounds of American life. And that idea planted a seed that would bloom in a major way in the 20th century.
Okay, so let's get into that 20th century explosion, because this is where things get really interesting.
This is where the American sound really crystallizes. And the first figure you have to talk about is Charles Ives. According to the Arsh Foundation, Ives was born in New England and rejected the polished constraints of the German tradition in favor of the sounds he heard in daily life. He pioneered a polytonal approach, layering folk melodies, camp meeting hymns, and marching band fragments all at once.
Polytonal meaning multiple keys at the same time?
Exactly. And the LSO article describes it well. Ives drew upon hymns, folk songs, band tunes, and parlor songs, blending them with modern harmonic techniques. It was a definitive break from the rigid structures of European conservatories. The Arsh Foundation calls it an experimental spirit that reflected the cultural plurality of the United States.
And then comes Gershwin.
Gershwin is a whole conversation. According to Public Domain Music, George Gershwin was born in Brooklyn in 1898 and started his career as a song plugger in Tin Pan Alley before achieving fame with Broadway musicals. His most famous work, Rhapsody in Blue, came out in 1924 and became an iconic piece symbolizing the fusion of classical music and jazz.
Rhapsody in Blue is one of those pieces that even people who say they don't like classical music know and love.
Completely. And he also composed An American in Paris and the opera Porgy and Bess, which introduced the song Summertime. Public Domain Music notes that his innovative approach bridged the gap between popular and classical genres, and his work continues to influence composers and musicians across the world. He died at 38, which is just staggering to think about.
38. And he'd already done all of that.
All of that. And then you have Aaron Copland, who is in some ways the central figure of this whole story. He's referred to by his peers and critics as the Dean of American Music. That's from both Wikipedia and the Arshfa Foundation. He studied in Paris under Nadia Boulanger, came back to the US, and set about creating what he called his vernacular style.
Vernacular style, what does that actually mean in practice?
It means music that was deliberately accessible. According to Wikipedia's Copland entry, he shifted in the mid-1930s to a style that could serve both utilitarian and artistic purposes. Music for use, as he put it. Works like Appalachian Spring from 1944, Rodeo from 1942, and Fanfare for the Common Man from 1942. The open, spacious harmonies in his music are what many people think of when they think of the sound of America.
Fanfare for the Common Man. Even the title is a statement.
It really is. And his work earned him a Pulitzer Prize and an Academy Award, according to Public Domain Music. But what's also remarkable is that Copland wasn't just composing, he was educating. The Interlude article notes that Bernstein and Copland were popular educators who helped both the spread of European classical music in the United States and the development of American classical music.
Speaking of Bernstein, there's this incredible story about how he and Copland actually met, right?
It's one of those stories that sounds almost too good to be true. According to the Leonard Bernstein website, in 1937, a teenage Leonard Bernstein unexpectedly met Aaron Copland at a dance recital in New York City. They were sitting next to each other and were introduced by a poet named Muriel Rukeyser. Copland was already a musical hero to Bernstein. Aaron invited him to a birthday party that night, and that was the start of a deep personal and professional relationship that lasted the rest of their lives.
A chance encounter at a dance recital introduced by a poet. That's the origin of one of the most important musical partnerships in American history.
And the Bernstein website notes something almost eerie. Copland was 18 years older than Bernstein, and they passed away within 6 weeks of each other in 1990. Their letters to each other were extraordinary. Copland called Bernstein Lenny Penny and Lensk. Bernstein called Copland Aaron Excelsus and Earth Scorcher.
Earth Scorcher. That's a nickname.
Only Bernstein could pull that off. And Bernstein's own contributions were enormous, West Side Story being the most famous, which the interlude article notes has been reinterpreted multiple times. He fused high and low art in a way that was genuinely new.
Now, I want to get into something that I think is underappreciated, the minimalists. Because the interlude article makes a pretty bold claim about them.
It does, and I think it's a defensible claim. The interlude article says that perhaps the ones who had the most important impact on classical music around the world were the minimalists. We're talking about Philip Glass, Steve Reich, Terry Riley, John Adams, and the article points out that Glass and Reich both participated in shaping electronic music, film music, and even popular music.
So their influence went way beyond the concert hall.
Way beyond. And the ARFA Foundation describes their approaches in interesting ways. Philip Glass is characterized by rhythmic pulse, Steve Reich by phasing and soundscapes. The interlude article also notes that this whole minimalist wave wouldn't have existed without the avant-garde work of composers like John Cage, who is described as one of the most unique composers not just for his music but for his own artistic development.
And Terry Riley's In C is mentioned specifically as groundbreaking.
Yes, the interlude article calls it groundbreaking. Riley is described as the pioneer of that movement. And what's interesting is that these composers were working in a tradition that was distinctly American, experimental, boundary-pushing, not beholden to European forms, while simultaneously influencing music globally.
There's also a political dimension to all of this that I think is worth getting into. Because American composers weren't just responding to musical trends, they were responding to history.
This is really well documented. There's a 2023 PhD dissertation from the University of Maine by Christine Letcher that looked at how social, cultural, and political environments influenced American classical composers, specifically comparing the post-9/11 period to the New Deal and early Cold War eras.
And what did she find?
One of the consistent findings across both eras was that composers have what she calls a high aesthetic bias. They want to compose substantial music that stands on its own and is deemed honest and authentic. During the New Deal and Cold War, composers made aesthetic choices because of the political climate, and the dissertation found similar pressures in the post-9/11 period.
So the music was never really separate from what was happening in the country.
Never. And Copland is actually a perfect example of that. Wikipedia notes that he shifted to his accessible vernacular style during the Great Depression, specifically because modernist orchestral music was unprofitable in that economic climate. The political and economic reality shaped the music directly.
That's a really important point. The American sound wasn't just an artistic choice, it was partly a survival strategy.
Exactly. And the Letcher dissertation also found something interesting about gender. Out of 5 female composers interviewed, only 1 spoke about gender being a concern, and she framed it in terms of not wanting her legacy to be forgotten the way female composers of past generations were. Which brings us to the rediscovery of Florence Price.
Florence Price is someone whose name is coming up more and more. What's her story?
The R Foundation describes her as a contemporary trailblazer who is being rediscovered. She's part of a broader pattern of American composers, particularly women and composers of color, whose work was overlooked for decades and is now being reassessed. The R Foundation also mentions Caroline Shaw and Jessie Montgomery as modern innovators representing diverse voices of the 21st century.
So the story of American classical music is still being written.
Very much so. And that's actually one of the things that makes it so compelling. The ARFA Foundation puts it well. American classical music composers created a distinct national identity by blending European traditions with jazz, folk, and experimental sounds. That blending is ongoing. It didn't stop with Copland or Glass.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about the minimalists having the broadest global impact. Do you think that's actually a stronger claim than saying Copland or Gershwin had the biggest impact?
It's a fair challenge. I think Gershwin and Copland defined what American classical music sounded like to the world. They gave it an identity. But the minimalists, according to the Interlude article, actually changed the direction of music globally. Electronic music, film scores, popular music. That's a different kind of impact. It's broader, even if it's less immediately recognizable.
So Gershwin and Copland gave America a voice, and the minimalists gave that voice a megaphone that reached everywhere.
That's a good way to put it. And the Interlude article makes the point that the history of American classical music is undoubtedly shorter than its European counterpart, but the speed at which it evolved results in a very rich repertoire, compressed timeline, enormous output.
And it's not a single identity either. The Interlude article is pretty clear on that.
Right, it says American music cannot be reduced to a single and simple identity. There have been many movements and genres, modernists influenced by jazz, avant-gardists, minimalists, and more. That plurality is actually the point. The American sound is not one sound, it's the capacity to hold many sounds at once.
Which is very American when you think about it.
Completely. And Charles Ives understood that intuitively before anyone else did. The ARFA Foundation describes his polytonal approach as creating a complex musical landscape that reflected the cultural plurality of the United States. He was composing the American experience before there was even a language for it.
There's also something worth noting about the role of Samuel Barber in all of this. He's sometimes overshadowed by Copland and Bernstein, but his adagio for strings is everywhere.
Barber is a great example of a different strand of the American tradition. Grokipedia describes him as contributing lyrical romanticism with adagio for strings from 1936, calling it a staple of American orchestral repertoire. He wasn't chasing the folk-inflected American sound the way Copland was. He was doing something more inward, more emotionally direct, and it resonated just as deeply.
Adagio for strings gets used in films, in memorial services, in moments of collective grief. It's become almost a universal language for a certain kind of feeling.
And that's the thing about the best American classical music. It transcends its origins. It stops being American and just becomes human. That's the real measure of its importance.
I also want to circle back to the Kennedy Center's framing of this, because they make a point that I think is easy to miss. America's place in classical music came not so much through experimental work, but through Hollywood movies. That's a wild claim.
It is, and it's worth sitting with.
The Kennedy Center's resource on American classics makes the point that in the 20th century, America took its place as a force in the world of classical music through film music. Think about what that means. The most widely heard orchestral music in the world for most of the 20th century was American. And it was in movie theaters. So classical music reached more people through Hollywood than through concert halls.
That's the implication. And it connects back to what Copland was doing with his vernacular style, music for use, music that serves a purpose, music that meets people where they are. That's a very American approach to art.
Okay, so when you step back from all of this, from the psalm books to the minimalists, from Amy Beach to Philip Glass, what's the through line? What's the thing that makes American composers matter to classical music as a whole?
I think it's the willingness to break the mold. Every major American composer we've talked about did something that European conservatories would have considered wrong or strange or inappropriate. Ives layered incompatible sounds. Gershwin brought jazz into the concert hall. Copland made classical music feel like it belonged to ordinary people. The minimalists stripped everything down to almost nothing. Each of those moves was a kind of audacity.
And that audacity came from being outside the tradition, from not having centuries of European classical heritage to feel obligated to.
Exactly. The ARFA Foundation frames it as early American composers moving away from European imitation by incorporating local folk tunes and experimental structures. But it's more than that. It's that America had no choice but to invent something new because it didn't have the old thing to fall back on. And that necessity became a creative superpower.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. We started this conversation with America as a musical backwater. The Kennedy Center's words, not ours, a place where classical music barely existed while Europe was producing Bach and Handel. And what happened over the next 3 centuries is one of the most remarkable creative transformations in the history of music.
And it happened because of a specific set of choices. The choice to draw from Black spirituals and Native American music, as Dvorak urged. The choice to blend jazz with orchestral forms, as Gershwin did. The choice to make music accessible and rooted in everyday American life, as Copland did. The choice to strip music down to its most essential elements, as the minimalists did. Each of those choices expanded what classical music could be.
And the story isn't finished. The Arfa Foundation points to Florence Price being rediscovered, to Caroline Shaw and Jessie Montgomery as contemporary voices. The tradition is still evolving.
And that's maybe the most important thing to take away. American classical music isn't a closed chapter. It's an ongoing conversation between the past and the present, between European roots and American experience, between the concert hall and the street. The composers who matter most are the ones who kept that conversation alive and pushed it somewhere new.
So the next time you hear Rhapsody in Blue in an airport, or Appalachian Spring in a film, or a Philip Glass score underneath something you're watching, you're hearing the result of a centuries-long argument about what American music should sound like. And the answer, it turns out, is all of the above.
That's it, exactly. America started as a musical backwater and ended up rewriting the rules for the whole world. Not bad for a country that began with a psalm book.
Not bad at all. If this episode made you want to go put on Appalachian Spring or Rhapsody in Blue, do it. You'll hear it differently now.
Thank you for joining us today on Classical Music Discoveries as we explored the remarkable legacy of American composers and their profound influence on the classical tradition. Their voices, bold, diverse, and unmistakably original, continue to shape the sound of modern music and inspire generations of performers and listeners alike. If you enjoyed today's program, we invite you to support our work. Simply use the safe and secure PayPal QR code appearing on your screen to make a small donation. Every contribution helps us bring exceptional music and performances to audiences around the world. For Classical Music Discoveries, I'm David Devine. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to sharing more great music with you again soon.